Good morning and welcome to this webinar, The Legal Landscape of NIS2, What Businesses Need to Know. Firstly, let's do a safety check. Make sure that you're in a safe and secure location as we kick off this meeting and throughout the 1-hour event. Now, let me introduce you to today's presenters. We have for you Professor Dr. Dennis Kenji Kipker, who is Scientific Director at the Cyber Intelligence Institute in Germany. And we also have Tobias Nisch, who is Global Cybersecurity Practice Lead at ABB. Now I'll hand over the presentation to Tobias, who will go through today's agenda.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Martina. Welcome today to our presentation. I will start with a short recap on NIS2. What are the critical sectors? What are the stricter security requirements? And especially talking about how ABB can support in incident response, business continuity management, supply chain, and reporting obligations. We will also have a short information about how penalties and fines are handled, or let's say what we think should be shared about it at the moment. And then I will hand over to Dennis, who is with me, and he will talk about in much more detail about the EU member state comparison, how they are starting or have done the transposition into local laws so far, and how the legal landscape looks into in detail on some of the countries he has done a research study about. First of all, this is again the critical sectors that are covered by NIS2. Many of you might be aware of it. Some might have joined us today without that kind of detailed experience. But here you will find a lot of industries in the essential or important services that ABB serves. That's why we have started these kind of sessions that we do today. Let's quick talk about the cybersecurity risk management measures that these industries need to follow. You will find these topics here. Basically, these are minimum requirements the most of our industries already do or should do. Depending on where that can be applied based on the risk approach, we will look into more detail on some specific one today. For example, the incident handling topic. Here, for sure, if you need to do incident handling, that means you have to do it from the beginning, meaning you need to identify or even prevent incidents to happen. Then you need to be able to identify, contain, and also report about it. And to do that within a specific time frame, we as ABB offer you with our care contracts the framework that you can cover these reaction times together with your partners like ABB. We also have something like the cybersecurity workplace, which covers foundational security controls that you have seen in the slide before, which will support you, for example, with backup and recovery, with threat detections, but also with keeping an eye on all the security controls that you have implemented, the foundational security controls, if they are still working as they should, like you monitor continuously the effectiveness of these controls. And then last, I want to mention the cybersecurity event monitoring, which is a solution designed for the OT space and our systems, which also do not only cover like Windows event, network type event, but also DCS system events, security events, and do correlation rules with that, which helps you in an incident case to respond quickly and also report on the indicators correctly. Then going over to the business continuity, if something has happened, you need to be able to maintain your business up and running to some degree. And here again, we have some, you see again, event monitoring, the cybersecurity workplace, but also we help you with creating the business continuity management plan if you want to have that from a consulting perspective. Also, we have solutions like design, backup, and recovery solutions for our DCS systems, combined with the care framework, again, helping you getting everything restored or maintained or up and running in the way that you need it. What is also newly introduced with NIS2 is focus on the supply chain security. Means we as a supplier to you or others supplying to ABB, and we need to take care of that they also handle cybersecurity adequately. So we need to have vendor audits or need to verify that they follow best practices or global standards like the ISO 27000 or IEC 62443. Then there are the reporting obligations. This is one of the, I think, one of the biggest topics on the regulation side. This is newly introduced with NIS2 that you need to notify without undue delay, and if the event is significant, and then you also, what means significant? It means that it has a severe impact either on the operation or on the financials, and or it has impact, especially in the customers that are, for example, in energy industries or oil and gas, that also could have an effect on natural or legal persons or damage. How to do that? How to notify with undue delay? I think, first of all, you need to be able to identify them. You need to have context to what you see there on the screen. So you should have the OT covered the perspective. And to do so, we support you with predefined use cases, predefined detection rules, and so on with our event monitoring solution. That's what I wanted to say, which also then helps you together with the reaction times and the agreements in place to report within the time frame needed. Here is our risk reduction roadmap, and I mapped the different articles from the NIS2 to our portfolio offerings. You see on the left hand, it starts with a defensible design, which means you need to identify the risk, you need to have a reference architecture in place, and do the basic hygiene. Then it goes into mitigating the risk with, for example, foundational security controls, simplify that for the audience so that even people that are not cybersecurity expert can recognize and maintain a system, for example, with our cybersecurity workplace, and identify if something's wrong, and can include then the experts. So with that said, we have created a lot of data, so we need to make sure that we have from that data a deterministic view and can make use of it. Therefore, we have these network monitoring, event monitoring, and finally security operations and incident response services. Okay. What we also want to mention is the penalties and non-compliance, but I don't want to show you just the numbers and the fines, but I want to talk about that. There are studies, for example, from IBM, a company that follows strict regulations and has a cybersecurity regulation program in place. They suffer less, and if an incident happens, and incidents can happen, so therefore it is even good to follow these kind of initiatives. And we have also got the information from, for example, the BSI, that they will focus primarily on the cooperation with the industries and not on the supervision or the fining. So that said, I would hand over to talk about the thing that you might be most interested into, which is the latest report coming from Dennis and his institute, where he has looked for ABB into how the different countries, implement the laws into local laws. Hand over to you, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for the possibility to speak here today, and welcome everyone to my part of this short webinar on Monday morning about NIS2. And Tobias already mentioned the most important legal regulations that we can find in NIS2. And introducing my part here today will not be a full introduction of NIS2 and how everything will work in detail. So it's mostly about an overview to see how the European member states are dealing with the national implementation of NIS2. And as you all know, NIS2 is a directive. It's not a regulation. So as a directive, it's not directly applicable in all the European member states. It has to be implemented in national legislations. And this is what the member states are currently doing. And the time frame for implementing this directive for cybersecurity ends this week. So it's quite a current topic that we are facing here. And this is also why I guess it's important to speak about NIS2 in a European member state comparison today. And together with ABB, we have conducted a study regarding this NIS2 implementation in all the different member states. And I guess this is an interesting topic. And as far as I know, we have a lot of different people here today in this webinar coming from all over the world, not only the European Union. And this also means that on one hand, there's no one source of information for implementation of NIS2. Even the European Commission has not published a single document on that, only for NIS1, which is quite outdated from 18th of October this year. And secondly, we also can see that not only European member states are dealing with cybersecurity issues, but of course, cybersecurity is a global thing we have to talk about. And this is why there are a lot of international states looking on how we in the European Union are currently implementing NIS2 and are dealing with this framework. And as Tobias also mentioned on one of the first slides, he stated that NIS2 is not a regulation or not a directive only for critical infrastructure. We already had NIS1, which was dealing with essential services. That means critical infrastructures. But now we see that NIS2 is a special a decree which says that cybersecurity is a task for the economy in total. So that means there are really a lot of companies that will be affected. Alone in Germany, it can be assumed that at least 30,000 to 40,000 additional companies will be affected by NIS2 by these different industry regulations. And this is why it is important to take a closer look. Also, we might assume that NIS2 is only a directive, and there's a so-called minimum harmonization principle in the European Union that it should be implemented in every member state nearly the same way. We will soon see in a few minutes that this is not the case. So there are a lot of different specifications that are technically taken in the member states. There are also some different specifications regarding the scope of application of NIS2. And thirdly, we also see somewhat different timeframes. Also, we have one single date, that means 17th of October, so this week as implementation deadline. We see that there are really still some member states on their way of implementation. So that means even though we say or we talk about one single cybersecurity regulation in the European Union, we currently see that the levels of implementation are very different, and therefore it is also in some way different for international agitating companies to be compliant to NIS2, but because it does not only mean you have to be compliant to one single directive of European Union law, but essentially you have to be compliant with the respective national member state legislation. And this is also why I consider today's webinar of high importance when it comes to multinational corporations to see whether they are affected in certain states and what this means for them in certain member states of the European Union. It is to say that this is only a short webinar, so of course we cannot all cover all states that have been covered in this report. We will also be dealing with some which I consider the most interesting ones, not the most important ones, but the most interesting ones. And it is also to say that we currently have 27 member states in the European Union. So there are still some states who have not even started with legal implementation of NIS2. For example, stating Spain, or mentioning France, they are still at a very early state of adoption of NIS2, and this is also a reason why I do not deal directly with these states, because there's not much information available out there regarding national implementation. So let's go to the key findings and differences outlined in the report. As I mentioned, I have picked out several countries which I consider most interesting, and we will start here with the first country, Austria. So my part of this presentation follows always the same principle. So I will present to you one country and the status and realization of national implementation, and afterwards we can have a short chat or a Q&A to talk about national specialties regarding the implementation of NIS2. And when it comes to Austria, it is to say that Austria started relatively early with the implementation of NIS2, but unfortunately, even though from a topical perspective, Austria is quite far in implementation, legally speaking, and politically speaking, of course, have been some problems. So on April 3rd, 2024, the first draft implementation at federal level in Austria for NIS2 has been published. And this draft implementation was very interesting because it included a so-called comprehensive annex. I will come to this later on as well. And it was submitted to the public, and it should change several laws regarding information security in Austria. That means the Network Information Security Act and the Telecommunications Act, as well as the Health Telematics Act of Austria. And we had in Austria a public hearing in the parliament, but in summer this year, the bill has been rejected by the National Council for some political reasons and constitutional framework reasons. So even though we had a relatively early law in Austria, even though, in my opinion, it was not that bad, due to some constitutional restraints, this law has been cancelled. And this is why the Austrian government has to start from the scratch with the implementation. I'm quite sure that they will not change everything, but some issues of this law will have to be fixed to be constitutionally compliant here. And as I mentioned, it is interesting to see how the Austrian government tries to deal with the technical and organizational measures. Tobias also mentioned during his presentation, because there are a lot of uncertainties on how these issues should be dealt with. And you will see that later on in some of the countries' presentations, that nearly each country in the European Union is taking a different approach on how regulating cybersecurity measures for companies. And as I mentioned, for Austria, we have a so-called Appendix 3, which encloses in a very detailed way how individual measures for risk assessment should be made by the companies affected in form of tabular lists. So we find regulations for governance bodies, security policies, risk management, as well as asset management, human resources, basic cyber hygiene measures, and cybersecurity training, supply chain security, which is considered very important for NIS2 from a contractual level, but also from a technical level. Measures of access control are mentioned in this annex regulation: security, procurement, development, operation and maintenance, as well as cryptography, handling of cybersecurity incidents, business continuity and crisis management, up to environmental and physical security. So you see that the Austrian government is really taking a whole faceted approach here, taking into account analog threats to IT infrastructure, as well as cyber threats to IT infrastructure, which I consider of high importance as well, because NIS2 is not a single regulation that stands in a monolithic way in the EU legal infrastructure for cyber. It is also closely linked to the European Cyber Entities Resilience Directive, which is also implemented currently in the European member states and which is dealing with analog threats for IT systems, but mainly for critical infrastructures. And both laws have to be implemented together. And you can see here quite good how this implementation works when two European directives with different protective goals are implemented in the European member states. I consider that catalog quite helpful, but as I mentioned, unfortunately, in Austria, we have to go back to the first step of the legislative procedure to start with when it comes to the implementation of NIS2. Comparing Austria to Belgium, it is to say that Belgium is one of the countries that has already implemented NIS2 relatively early. So Belgium is one of the countries where it can be stated that the NIS2 directive will enter into force, national implementation, this week. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have this deadline on 17th of October 2024. That's in a few days. And on April 18th, 2024, the Belgian Parliament passed this corresponding NIS2 implementation law in the country, which was entitled Law Establishing a Framework for the Cybersecurity of Networks and Information System of General Interest for Public Security. And here you can see in this title of this law, this general approach, because it's not only about critical infrastructure protection. We had this with NIS1. It's about protecting the society, the economy, also in some countries, state authorities as well as a whole. So cybersecurity is to be considered a topic of general interest for general public security, and this is what we can find in this Belgium national implementing law. And the interesting thing for Belgium is, when we also compare it to some other countries later on, that we have on one hand a royal decree. This has also been published on June 9, 2024, which implements and specifies certain legal provisions. So it can be considered that this Belgium regulation is to be seen a more general regulation compared, for example, to the Austrian law, and that there are a lot of special provisions which are concretized by sub-legal decrees. And in Belgium, as the law already exists, we have two authorities which are mainly in charge for the implementation of NIS2. So firstly, of course, the Belgian Cybersecurity Authority, that means the Center for Cybersecurity Belgium, the CCB, and as cybersecurity is a topic for public security, also the National Crisis Center, the NCCN, is in charge of implementing this. And in Germany, for example, where we come later on to, we see a quite similar approach where we have two authorities. One of them is in charge for implementation, but they have to work together because we have this holistic approach of securing critical systems. And as we have a law in Belgium, the legislation will come into force on 18th of October 2024, so this week. And there's a registration duties for companies that are affected. We find this registration duty in nearly every member state of the European Union. And this also means that the companies affected will have to find out for themselves if they are affected by this regulation. So it is to say that mostly there will be not a letter or an email coming from the National Cybersecurity Authority stating that you are possibly a part of this NIS2 regulation. It's like with every kind of regulation. So you have to find out for yourself. You have to check the criteria. That means the quantity criteria. If you fall within the thresholds by numbers of the European sites cap rule, and quality criteria on the other hand, that you fall within the sectors aforementioned by Tobias, which are affected by NIS2. And this registration in Belgium for companies which are affected by NIS2 has to be completed by March 18, 2025, the latest. And it is also to say, when it comes to implementation in Belgium, the National Implementing Act of NIS2 refers to a special minimum catalog of measures, which is called the Cyber Fundamentals Framework, which you can also find on the World Wide Web, where you can find some aspects. And it is to say that regarding the implementation, the Belgian law says that this Cyber Fundamentals Framework of Belgium covers all aspects of NIS2 minimum realization for entities that will be affected here in this state. Well, coming to the next one, we go to the Scandinavian countries. As you can see, I've ordered this by alphabet here. What's about Finland? So normally I would say, yeah, the Scandinavian countries are very far with digitization. Yeah, they are, of course, but when it comes to the cybersecurity regulation, they are not as far as some other countries are in the European comparison. So in Finland, the NIS2 directive, the implementing procedure has already started, of course. It is at an advanced stage, politically and content-wise saying, but it has not yet been implemented so far. And there was a first draft bill that had been published by the Finnish government for a public consultation in November 2023. And half a year later, on May 2024, the government submitted a legislative proposal based on this first draft bill to the Finnish parliament for this national implementation of NIS2. And when we take a closer look onto the Finnish draft version, we can see that compared, for example, to Belgium and some other states that will follow in this presentation, that Finland is trying to conduct a minimum approach of implementation of NIS2. So I would consider the draft versions that we can see here quite vague. So there are, for example, not any extension of the scope of application or regarding the technical and organizational obligations considered in this Finnish draft version. And it is also interesting to see, as you have might realized it, during the, for example, in Belgium, we have two authorities which are mainly in charge for supervision of NIS2 compliance, whereas in some other countries in the European Union, such as Finland, there's no centralization of supervisory authorities. That means monitoring of compliance with NIS2 plans. So Finland says we transfer the compliance check of NIS2 not to one single authority, but rather to sector-specific authorities. So what are the authorities that are mentioned here in the draft version? Finnish Transport and Communications Agency, Traficom, the Energy Agency of Finland, the Finnish Safety and Chemicals Agency, the South Cyber Center for Economic Development, the Transport and the Environment, the Finnish Food Administration, the National Welfare and Health Inspectorate, Valvira, and the Finnish Medicines Agency, Fimea. So the means supervision is split through these different authorities, which makes it in some way, on one hand, easier for the authorities to implement the rules because they know the specific sectors and how they work. On the other hand, it's more difficult for companies in some way because when you're a company, for example, a multinational company having different departments, for example, health, chemicals, or also food, energy, you will have to deal with several authorities that are in charge, and this will be definitely interesting for authorities as well as for the affected companies to find best practices here when it comes to how all these authorities work together, how information is being shared, which I consider really an interesting development when it comes to Finland. Germany, broadly discussed how NIS2 is being addressed in Germany, and unfortunately, it is to say that even though in Germany we are dealing with cybersecurity and regulation for a long time, so the German cybersecurity central authority, the Federal Information Security Agency, BSI, has been established already more than 30 years ago in 1991. We are currently struggling with the implementation of NIS2. So that means even though we are at an advanced stage, at least in terms of content for NIS2 implementation, it is still not yet implemented. This has several reasons, content-wise reasons, political reasons, but generally speaking, the first draft was already published more than a year ago, and it took a long time really to get to a final official government draft. And this official government draft was adopted by the government of Germany on July 22 this year. And regarding the legislative procedure, this governmental draft has been transferred to the ordinary legislative procedure in the national parliament, the so-called Bundestag, and the first reading in the German national parliament took place on Friday last week, on October 11th. And when it comes to risk management and how this is conducted, we see that the German regulation is mostly based on the provisions that we can find directly in the NIS2 directive. That means the catalog of minimum security measures has nearly been copied one-to-one into the German transposing law, which I consider quite dangerous, but I will talk about this later on as well when we get to the other countries. And for the reporting procedure, and this is also one interesting fact that is specific topic for Germany that we also cannot find in all other legislations. We have a very graduated catalog of reporting obligations for cybersecurity incidents of affected institutions. So the reporting catalog in Germany distinguishes between an early initial report, a confirmatory initial report, the interim report, and the progress report, and the final report. So it is to be assumed that a German cybersecurity authority and the companies affected will have to work very closely together. There will be, in practice, relatively intense exchange of cybersecurity relevant information, which I consider good. And Germany has a long tradition of companies cooperating with the authorities in charge in so-called public-private partnerships. And we see this approach that has been taken for several years also in the field of national implementation of NIS2 in Germany. And it can be assumed regarding the time frame in Germany, the political procedure will follow in the next months until Christmas, and the so-called NIS2 Implementation and Cybersecurity Strengthening Act in Germany will come into force in the beginning of 2025. So it might be set March, April, based on the political decision making and the procedures, and if there are any flaws that are publicly announced and so on. So, but we are in a good way in Germany dealing with that. The next country I would like to present very shortly in comparison to the other ones as well is Hungary, because Hungary is really interesting when it comes to NIS2 implementation. The law has already been implemented there, and Hungary was one of the first countries in the European Union implementing NIS2 because this national transposition law for NIS2 came into force already on May 23rd, 2023. So nearly 1.5 years from now, dating back, we had the finishing of the consultation phase politically and legally speaking of this Hungarian law. And according to this Hungarian transposition, we have already had some time to address NIS2. So affected companies by NIS2 had to register online with the Hungary Supervisor Authority for Regulated Affairs, the so-called SARA, by June 30, 2024. So, for example, where we say that in a lot of countries in the European Union, we are skipping the time frame to 2025 or even to 2026. In Hungary, the authorities already had the duty, and of course the companies as well, to verify the implementation regarding the different entities affected by June 30 this year. So that means in the middle of summer. And when you're an affected company in Hungary, you are divided into different risk classes. And there's 3 so-called risk classes. So we have a basic level, we have an intermediate level, so qualified requirements is called, and we also have a high security class that, in my opinion, can be synonymously used possibly for critical infrastructure providers. And you have the higher, of course, you are in these levels, the higher are the cybersecurity requirements you must comply with according to NIS2. And now we come to the most interesting part, I think, of the Hungarian transpositioning law, because the Hungarian government did not only say, well, we incorporate the rules of NIS2 into our national law. That's one thing, of course, that has to be done. But the Hungarian government also said we create a special ministerial decree, the so-called Cyber Science Act, that also came into force in summer this year on June 24 this year. And it says, or it specifies what technical and organizational measures for cybersecurity NIS2 compliance in Hungary means. And this can also be seen here at the last bullet point. The Cyber Science Act is particularly relevant for the Hungarian implementation of NIS2 in practice, because it is a 120-page document that contains precise specifications for cybersecurity certification and monitoring with regard to risk management, a catalog of measures, and a catalog of hazards. So, as we have seen, for example, Belgium takes some kind of minimum approach. Austria has one annex regulation, the Annex 3 of the law, which contains a table of relevant measures that have to be taken by the companies. German takes a minimum approach by copying Article 21, paragraph 2 of NIS2 into national implementation law. We see that in Hungary, they have created a 100-page document, a special legal decree only for implementation of NIS2. We'll see how this works in practice. Of course, on one hand, it's good for the companies to get some legal certainty, to see, well, what means a division of different risk classes really for me as a company. But on the other hand, there's always a danger when you have such catalogs that some measures are missing, that some measures directly do not fit to an individual risk management of a company, a certain branch or sector. So we'll see how this works. But you see, on one hand, we have really nothing for concrete implementation, and on the other hand, we have 120 pages giving more information on implementation. And I would consider this a very, very different approach in one European Union for one legal decree that we can see here. Yeah, so that was a Hungarian perspective. Italy, it's also quite interesting, because Italy has very recently implemented this law into, that means NIS2, into the national legislation, because on August 7, this year, the Italian Council of Ministers met and decided on the national implementation of NIS2 in a corresponding national legislative decree. And this means also that the Italian regulation of NIS2 will also come into force this week on 18th of October 2024. And when it comes to Italy, we have so far spoken about the differences and distinguishments when it comes to implementation, technical and organizational measures for NIS2. But so far, we had not been dealing with the different scope of applicability of NIS2, because based on NIS2, it is possible to have a stronger regime on cybersecurity, because the European Union says with NIS2, we just conduct some basic level. That means principle of minimum harmonization. But when there are certain countries who say that certain branches, industries are of high importance for us, then this might be in other countries compared in the European Union. We can also set some higher thresholds and values for these industries as well. And this has been done by the Italian legislator here as well. For example, it is said that legal services for large food retailers are also covered by the implementing NIS2 regulation, which I consider quite interesting. But we all know that good food comes from Italy, so it might be also reasonable to protect here the supply chain, but also the cultural sector. So we have nearly no country in the European Union which says the cultural sector is of critical importance. Why that in Italy? Because it is considered by the Italian government that the cultural sector is very important for the well-being and for the wealth of the country, because there are a lot of tourists coming to Italy. So the cultural sector has a high economic value, and that means when there are cyber attacks, there's a high economic impact when cultural institutions do not function anymore. And this is why the Italian government says we need to protect these entities as well. And as Italy has made a punctual implementation of NIS2, from October 18th this week, the National Cybersecurity Agency, ACN, will set up an online platform where all companies affected by NIS2 will have to register. So this is the same. You have to identify, you have to make legal checks if you are affected. When you see that you're affected, then you will have to register. And there's a deadline for this registration as well. So that means from January 1st to February 28th of the next year, these key entities can register on this platform or also update their registration. And the National Cybersecurity Authority of Italy, ACN, will then provide a feedback to these affected entities by end of March 2025, and which at this point, the implementation for the companies the duties will also begin. So when you have your final feedback, you're a part of NIS2 legislation in Italy, then you have 9 months for incidents and 18 months for obligations relating to administrative bodies and security measures. That means the technical and organizational measures. So we have very concrete timeframes given here in Italy for the implementation of the NIS2 directive. Let's come to the Netherlands very shortly, because the Netherlands, they also have not implemented NIS2, which some people also consider quite interesting, because when it comes to digital legislation, the Netherlands are normally quite far in the European Union. But it is to say that also in the Netherlands, there have been some political disputes about how to implement this, what the scope of application means, what the technical organization and reporting obligations mean for countries. That means the Netherlands, they have started implementing NIS2. They are in some way at an advanced stage, content-wise speaking, but they have still not finished. And the Ministry of Justice of the Netherlands also announced that they will not be able to publish a national NIS2 implementation this year. So it's quite clear in the Netherlands that they start only from 2025 on. And the Netherlands law for implementing NIS2 is called the Cybersecurity Act, and this was released for public consultation on May 21st this year. And this consultation period, the public consultation period, ended on July 1st this year as well. And in the Netherlands, there's a National Cybersecurity Center, the NCSC, which is the Central Cybersecurity Authority of the Netherlands. And this authority will also possibly be in charge for national implementation in the Netherlands. And there you can also see the differences, where some countries say we have a lot of different authorities that are in charge. For example, Finland. Netherlands say, well, we have one central authority that is dealing with the implementation of NIS2. And when it comes to technical and organizational measures in the Netherlands are really an extreme example of how this can also be done, because the Dutch law doesn't describe nothing. So it just describes that cybersecurity requirements have to be realized according to the state of the art of technology. And that's it. You will find just a few sentences about national implementation. And there's not even a minimum catalog of cybersecurity due diligence obligations described, such as we can find it in Article 21, paragraph 2 of NIS2, or in the German law, or in the Austrian law. We do not find that. And as you have seen it in Hungary, we have 120 pages for implementation. In the Netherlands, we have nothing. What's the reason behind that? It's quite easy to say. As I mentioned, it is quite dangerous also on one hand having such a detailed catalog, because you always can have measures that should be part of it or have been forgotten, or are not really fitting to a certain kind of industry or branch. And the Netherlands say, well, we have general regulation, which has no specifications in detail for technical measures that have to be taken. But instead of that, we have this general decree, and we also, based on this general decree, tailor sector-specific characteristic sub-legal decrees for possibly different branches to go into the details of regulation later on, which I consider not a bad approach, because in this level, it is easier to take on the different industries, branches, or associations to get into public-private partnerships, talk with people for implementation. I think this is quite an interesting approach, rather than having a 100 pages document detailing everything. But in practice, we'll have to see how this works really, and what's the best approach in the European Union. So I guess for this reason, this comparative approach of comparing different implementations of one single legal regulation in the European Union is not just a thing which is interesting now when the current laws are created, but it might also be interesting for the company affected during the next years when the implementation phase has been started. To conclude with some other countries before we finish, because we are running out of time, as I see, we have Poland. Poland is also interesting from one perspective. The Polish legislation has also not yet been finished regarding NIS2. And on April 23rd, the Polish Ministry of Digital Affairs had made available a draft amendment on the national Polish cybersecurity law, which is called the National Cybersecurity System, the NCSSA. And it is interesting that Poland, when it comes to technical and organizational obligations of NIS2, goes much beyond NIS2. Why that? Because they have very certain regulations on the protection of the digital supply chain. Digital supply chain is also one thing that is addressed by NIS2 in Article 21, paragraph 2, that you have to protect the digital supply chain when you use suppliers, software, hardware, or any kind of embedded systems or open source technology. But they say, well, we need trustworthiness in our IT. And I think trustworthiness is something that we are talking a lot about these days. And we have similar provisions, not only in Poland for the NIS2 implementation, but also in the Czech Republic, because they are also dealing with these digital supply chains. And in Poland, it is said, for example, the Ministry of Digital Affairs should be enabled to carry out procedures to determine a supplier as a so-called high-risk supplier. And this applies on one hand to the 5G network. There's a very long debate about digital sovereignty. I will not deal with that here during this presentation. But it is to be said in Poland that the government is trying to have this kind of digital supply chain security in principle for all areas of technology in which products and services are used, whose origin may pose a threat to state security. So it's not only about economic protection against cyber threats, it's about national security. And this is why in Poland, as well as in Czech Republic, they have some political difficulties in pushing this law through the parliament, because companies are saying, well, that goes beyond NIS2, that costs a lot of money, how we should deal with that. And the government, on the other hand, says, well, it's about a national security interest. It's not only about economic interest. And this is why we have a clash of different opinions here, which make it difficult for implementation, finding consensus. And this is why it takes in Poland some time for implementation. So this is why the Polish government says we'll not be able to finish, of course, the legislative procedure this week. It is considered to be certain that the national law will not come into force until 2025. So to come to a conclusion, and that's really the last country, and I think it's only half of the countries that we have been dealing with in the study, it's Sweden. Sweden also has not finished implementation of NIS2, which is really a pity. And there had been this so-called interim report, which is called New Rules on Cybersecurity, been published on March 5th this year. And this first report for implementation in Sweden was detailing the proposed adjustments and the introduction of a new law for implementation in Sweden, which is called the Cybersecurity Act. And there's a duty which came up on June 24th this year, and that the Swedish Post and Telecommunications Agency, the PTS, proposed an e-service to identify operators affected by NIS2, and they must register with this Swedish Post and Telecommunications Agency, and the overall responsibility for implementation of NIS2 and also regarding national duties will lie within the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, the MSB. And there are also some other partial supervisory authorities, but we can hope that Sweden will also finish national implementation in the next month. So to come to a short conclusion from my side, what have we seen? That's the left-hand side of this slide deck here. We have seen that there is this unique timeline, this time frame for finishing national adoption by October 17th this year. We have also seen that there are really a lot of states having difficulties in implementing it for several different reasons, but we have also seen that regarding the scope of application, of course, nearly all industries that are mentioned by NIS2 will be affected, whereas it is also possible for certain member states to add some additional industries into the framework of NIS2. And we have also seen that the national implementation, even though we have one single legal act in the European Union, is quite different. And that means it makes sense when you're a multinational company doing business in several countries of the European Union to deal with these national legislations. I'm sure that this is, of course, it might be costly, it might be very work intensive, but I guess it will be useful to do so because we have this very different implementations from member states, and possibly NIS2 will be some kind of general regulations such as a GDPR, which might be directly applicable in the member states, and it might be easier. But currently, we all have this kind of different applications. So thank you very much. That was my part. And I think, Tobias, I would like to give you the last word for finishing today's presentation.
Thank you, Dennis. I will keep it very, very short to have some time for Q&A. I just want to mention how ABB can support you. You have heard now and learned about the different approaches. We in ABB have our service teams all around the European countries, and we share our experience with you on how to implement in the OT space, in the DCS systems, the needed security controls. We can help you identifying best approach here. Just reach out to your sales teams, and we can help you with that on care agreements, product services, and so on. Going to Q&A now, I would say.
Thank you so much for that insightful session, Tobias and Dennis. It's so fascinating to learn about the various levels of NIS2 implementation across all these countries. Now, as Tobias said, we have a few minutes to answer any questions that you may have. I'd say don't miss the chance to get some legal advice on NIS2 from Dennis. And while we wait for you to pop in your questions, there's a short poll which we'd like you to answer. So I'm just going to launch that poll right now. Okay. You can answer the poll as we go through the questions. Let's go through, let's get to one of the questions. The guidance given to date has been quite weak as to whom NIS2 applies to. Whilst it states it's on certain sectors, it's not very clear. Manufacturing, for example. The NCSCSs in each country are saying, go get legal advice. Is there any checklist anywhere I can use to determine if it actually applies?
Yeah, that's one very good question. So there are national NCSCs, means national cybersecurity authorities, and some of these cybersecurity authorities have already published guidelines or online checks where you can quickly generally check if you would be if your company would be part of this NIS2 regulation. On the other hand, it is quite clear what this means generally speaking for a lot of companies, because NIS2 contains two general provisions. So a qualitative criterion, that means if you are part of these sectors and branches that are mentioned, and the quantitative criterion based on the European size cap rule. If you're a medium-sized enterprise, then you're generally part of the NIS2 regulation. And when it comes to the qualitative criterion, and I think this is a main part of this question because it asks for certain sectors that are not very clear, we find links in this document. That's one annex regulation of NIS2 for concretization rules, what, for example, manufacturing means. So generally speaking, when you take a closer look into the annex regulations of NIS2, for most companies, it is quite clear, generally speaking, if they fall within the scope of or not. It might be more problematic if you have a national company, an umbrella company, having different company daughters for checking the compliance. If these daughters of your company are part of your main company, then of course you should need or should get some legal advice. But generally speaking, you just need to put together these two criteria to find out if you're part of the regulation or if you're not. So generally speaking, not every company will have to get legal advice to find out whether it is part of NIS2 regulation or not.
All right. We have another question here. If our company operates across multiple EU countries, how should we manage cross-border NIS2 compliance?
Yeah, that's something that is still at the moment open, because NIS2 says that the company is in charge where the company offers its services. So when you have, for example, different markets in the European Union, it is also the case that different cybersecurity authorities in the European Union might be in charge. So that means registration will have to be done in the different countries of the European Union. And currently, as we do not have implementation laws in all of the European Union member states, it will be difficult also for the cybersecurity authorities to exchange information on that based on the cybersecurity framework given by the NISA. But I guess that this problem will be possibly be dealt with in the next years. But generally speaking, the national authorities are in charge. And this is also what we can see when it comes to GDPR compliance, because General Data Protection Rule also says, mainly speaking, that the national authorities are in charge. There can be one single authority that is in charge for cybersecurity compliance, but this has to be found out. So at the moment, I would advise to register when you're a company doing business in multiple countries of the European Union, to register in each country when it comes to NIS2 compliance.
We have another comment related to the same subject. Somebody's written, the company is regulated in the country where the compliance decisions are made. I just wanted to share that. Then we have a couple of other related questions. The questions are about supply chain. So one person asks, from supply chain perspective, what measures do we need to implement to ensure we are NIS2 compliant? And another person asks, how do we ensure that third-party suppliers or partners are NIS2 compliant? So related questions.
Yeah.
Same.
So generally speaking, this will be some kind of legal decision that has to be made. So you will not be able to check 100% compliance in practice for cybersecurity for each supplier. And most companies are using cloud computing infrastructure. That means software as a service, for example, or infrastructure as a service. And you will not be able to provide 100% cybersecurity supply chain compliance. But you might be able to create some legal obligations, some contracts, which you provide to your cloud computing operators to state that they have taken the minimum measures according to NIS2 compliance regarding technical and organizational measures for cybersecurity, and that you should be able to check this, theoretically speaking. But there again, we can take a close look to how GDPR has been implemented since 2018 in the European Union, because GDPR has similar obligations for contractual processing of personal data, and that also contains cybersecurity. So I think we can learn here a lot of the procedures that we have already implemented based on GDPR.
Interesting. There's time for one more question. Is there any compliance check for deliveries if NIS2 compliant?
Yeah, I would say no, because a compliance check, I assume that you mean technical and organizational measures, would mean that every kind of company or entity will have the same technical organization measures. There will be some TOMs that are relevant for all companies, for example, having backups, having adequate levels of data encryption, and so on, personal security. But generally speaking, there's no such a compliance check for every kind of company. But NIS2 reserves the possibility to create national standards, industry branch specific standards. So I would advise, and this is what I always do when it comes to NIS2, the different companies to found, for example, in the branch specific association, a working group for cybersecurity for NIS2 implementation, and to have an exchange of best practices, and to find the best practices in the respective sector and branch, then go to the National Cybersecurity Authority, which is in charge, and ask them if they agree with this kind of minimum catalog, branch-specific catalog, as a requirement for different companies in the branch. So this is a way I would tackle this challenge if I would be directly involved here as a company for NIS2 implementation.
Yeah, I would like to add something here, because I think also the NIS2 encourages the use of international or global standards and frameworks. So also that might be a wise approach to follow, for example, an ISO 27000 series or whatsoever a global standard that handles most of the measures that are also mentioned in NIS2. So that is for sure a wise approach.
All right, we have just about 15 seconds left. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Thank you, Dennis and Tobias, for sharing those insightful tidbits. And feel free to reach out to us if you need any support with NIS2. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.